I'm Bill Peschel, and welcome to Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents. Our guest today is an award-winning mystery novelist. She is the author of 3 novels in the Annie Oakley series, the first of which, A Girl with a Gun, won the Best Mystery Prize at the New Mexico-Arizona Book Awards, including the Tony Hillerman Award at the same event for scoring the most points of all the books in competition. She also has a new series set at the Ziegfeld Follies in 1920 featuring costume designer and amateur sleuth Grace Michelle, called Grace in the Wings. Please welcome to the show an author, teacher, educational consultant, and horsewoman, our guest, Kari Bovée. Kari, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
How's the weather out there in New Mexico?
Well, it's nice. It's hot. It's not as hot as it was last week. We were having, triple digits, but this week it's back down to high 90s and had some evening and nighttime rains, which is always nice. We're starting our monsoonal season, so that's always a great relief from the heat.
Mm-hmm. I was out in Phoenix, so I remember years ago, I can still remember just that hot, dry heat out there that just would drive you indoors. And we're having some of the same thing here in Hershey, but it's a lot damper.
Right, yeah. And sometimes, when it's not as humid, which it often isn't here, it doesn't feel quite as hot as it is. But yeah, I've been in Phoenix in those, those triple digits, 115, 119, and no thanks. I mean, it's much better here in New Mexico. We usually have about 100-degree temperatures for a week or two during the summer. It's usually not too bad.
Oh, so it's a lot more moderate than what I remember Phoenix being then.
Right. The elevation's a bit higher, and I think that helps.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about your writing career. Have you always been a writer? Have you always wanted to write?
Yeah, whether I was consciously aware that I wanted to be a writer, I have always been a writer ever since I was a little kid. I've always found that to just be the most comfortable way for me to express myself, and had, a wild imagination, and it was really a great way to harness that when I was, a young girl, and journaled all the time, wrote short stories and poetry and all of that. And when I got into college, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, and finally came to the conclusion that that English was probably the best major for me. And so started, reading all the, English literature classics and writing papers. And it was just so natural that, and I really enjoyed the writing process, which, is different than novel writing, but really enjoyed that. And so that's when I kind of decided I would like to pursue writing in one way or another.
Yeah. When you were doing your reading in English literature at that time, did any of that inform your writing today? Did you find anything to draw from, or was it more your contemporary reading?
No, it was very influential for me in the fact that I was doing a lot of British history and a lot of studying of the British classics, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, all those 19th century writers. And it really got me interested in the history of the area of England. And so when I was 30, my mother took me to England for the first time, and I just really got so excited about the history of it. And that's really when my love of history was born. And so in that regard, yes, it did very much influence, what I would be writing going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when it comes to something like writing a contemporary or writing historical, you feel more comfortable going back into the historical era. What is it about that area that draws you to it?
Well, yeah, the contemporary stuff, I love contemporary mysteries, and, Tony Hillerman was a huge influence on me as well. And I started out writing contemporary mysteries, but went back to history because I really liked the idea of when solving crimes back in, 100 years ago or further, they didn't have the technology that we have today to help assist. So it was based on, hard evidence and also that, a lot of intuition, like, people had to really follow their intuition, follow their gut. They didn't have technology to rely on. So I really liked that aspect of, particularly for writing mysteries.
Mhm.
And then of course, my love of history is, as soon as I get an idea for a novel and I start researching it, I just have a field day. I just love it.
Oh yes. Whenever I've gone back into doing whatever historical reading I'm doing, my wife is reading now about the history of the home in Victorian times, and
Oh, fun.
she's coming up at the breakfast table with just amazing facts and interpretations of facts as well, such as in the 1920s, how little of England was actually electrified, and how many people, like half the population, had to rely on candles just in order to light their homes.
Right. And a lot of them were suspicious of electricity, you know.
Exactly, yes. Just like
And
in the
you're
same
like,
way,
what is it? Yeah.
yeah, because they were just as suspicious of gaslighting, because of course if gaslighting, if the gas was turned off, you poison yourself. So what was electricity going to do as well?
Right. And how would it affect you, you know?
But there was also commentary at the time about how it was actually better to light your homes with candles or go back to wood stoves as opposed to these modern innovations. There was like this nostalgic for the past that the people who were writing the articles, writing the books, were trying to impose on people who realize, when you have a stove, it's a lot easier to cook your food than it is to light it on an open hearth.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, well, getting back to your earlier years, what were you reading when you were a child?
Oh my gosh. I read a lot of all of those horse novels by Marguerite Henry,
Mm.
Misty of I can
Chincat-
never say that word.
Chincoteague.
Uh, Chickadee. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can read it, but I can't say it. I read all of those. I read a lot of Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys mysteries. And then when I was about 12 or 13, I read Gone with the Wind. And I was just blown away by that novel. And that, it took me a long time to read it because I was pretty young and everything. And it's quite long, but and that's another reason why I think I was interested in the history of that time, of that Civil War period, and kind of how life was lived then. And so I read a lot of that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you in a family of readers?
Yes. My mother read some, but my father was a voracious reader, and he used to go on business trips when my brother and I were very young, and he would always come back and bring us something, and he always brought me books. And he would bring me books like when I was really young, there was a series of books on these little orphans in France. And so I loved those. He brought me 3 or 4 of those. And then he would also bring me, more nonfiction type books like classic painters or, you know, things that pertain to that, things that pertain to authors. And so he really fostered that in me, and always read to us when we were very young.
Hmm.
And we started off with Winnie the Pooh and all of those great classics. And so I think he really was the one who fostered that in me.
Hmm. Yeah. And he was also the one who kind of fostered your interest in Annie Oakley as well. I understand he recommended a documentary.
Right, exactly. I had worked on a novel that dealt with some of the history in New Mexico, and I was looking for something else to write, and I wanted to write mystery, but he suggested I watch this documentary, this PBS American Experience show on Annie Oakley, and I wasn't that interested because everything that I knew about Annie Oakley was portrayed in a very one-dimensional way. Like she was a very one-dimensional character in like Annie Get Your Gun and some of the movies that were done about her. So I was like, that's just fluff. I don't really want to spend my time on that, but he encouraged me. He said she really was a remarkable woman. And so I did watch it, and she was a very remarkable woman. I was immediately fascinated by her, and fascinated by her depth of character, what she went through as a child, how she worked in this field of men, surrounded by men, besting them all. And she was just this little tiny thing. She was, 5 feet tall. She probably weighed less than 100 pounds. And she was just a dynamo. And she really launched herself by being herself with this natural talent that she had. And I was fascinated, and but I didn't want to write a biography, and I didn't, so I thought, wow, I wonder what she'd be like as an amateur sleuth. And, from everything I had read and everything I'd seen, she was smart, she had the wherewithal, she was gutsy, she was perfect. So that's when I decided to try to write a mystery with her, and Girl with a Gun was born.
Mm-hmm. How did that start out? Were you able to really apply her to a mystery, or did it take some kind of effort to get rolling with that?
It took a little bit of effort. I had to come up with the crime, and I had to, of course, writing a mystery is like creating a big jigsaw puzzle. Not only do you have to solve the puzzle, you have to create the puzzle. And so it took a little bit of time for me to figure out what I wanted to do. And that book in particular, a lot of people ask me about my process, and it's really different with every book. But that book, it was really about doing the research, then doing some writing, then doing some more research, then doing more writing. And then as I would write, things would come up, and I'd think, oh, that's interesting. The subconscious kind of takes over. And then I would research that. And then, and then as I was researching, other things would come up, and I would be like, okay, now how am I going to put that into the story? So it was really, it was very much a give and take with the research and the writing, going back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah, I had written a number of short stories involving Mark Twain and Sherlock Holmes, and I found that trying to figure out how Samuel Clemens would actually act as opposed to how he would actually write was a big challenge, because I wanted to remain true to him and at the same time tell the story. So what was your relationship with Annie as you learned more about her and tried to figure out how she would act in a certain situation that, of course, she wouldn't in real life?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are, there's pretty standard accounts of her life and what she was like. But then I wanted to kind of breathe life into her. So, I did fictionalize a few things. I altered some timelines. I did embellished characters, embellished her a bit to make the story more interesting. But, I had always sort of seen her, and through my research, she was a very plucky individual. She was very determined. She was a strong woman. She didn't put up with much guff. So that part of making her an amateur sleuth, a strong female protagonist, was pretty easy. And so I think that I did a fairly good job of portraying her as she would have been in life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people might disagree, but I did the best that I could to stick with that.
One of the things that impressed me about the book was was that you portrayed her Quaker beliefs. So she would do things and then realize how she violated the tenet. I won't go into detail, that's kind of a spoiler, but she would do things and she'd have to reflect on her Quaker beliefs and react to them as well. And I think you captured that conflict very nicely.
Yes.
Does that show up in the later books as well?
Well, yeah. I thought it was a really interesting concept. And when I found out she was raised Quaker, I went ahead and did some research on Quakerism and sort of what their beliefs are. And it really resonated with how I wanted to create her as a character, in that they believe that everyone is equal. Like no one, they don't believe in titles. They don't believe that anyone is superior to anyone else. They were very much against slavery and very much against violence. But then I thought, wow, this was a woman who made her living shooting a gun, like, and you know, working in the arena with Buffalo Bill and the Indian War reenactments. And how did she feel about that? You know, and so it kind of created this built-in conflict with how did she reconcile, and also she was a ginormous celebrity. So she was, in a sense, different than, I wouldn't say superior, but she lived a more privileged life once she started working than a lot of her contemporaries. So how did she reconcile that? And so I thought it was a great way to bring in some good conflict into how she was raised, what her basic beliefs were, yet what she was faced with in this world where she was a huge celebrity.
Yeah. And she's also experiencing the beginnings of celebrity culture as well, because she's getting to be recognized, and she's having to deal a little bit with that, at least in the first book too.
Yeah, in the third book, in Folly at the Fair, she's at this point, she's been famous for quite some time. She's been on a couple of European tours. She's an international sensation. And she's starting to be a little bit road weary. It's wearing on her. It's wearing on her relationship with her husband. It's taking a toll, as I would imagine that kind of celebrity does. And so that was also a really interesting, an interesting thing to look into. It was like, you know, she couldn't be Miss Perky 24/7 for years. I mean, she obviously had difficulties in her life based upon her celebrity, based upon her fatigue. And, you know, she and Frank Butler had an amazing relationship. They were completely soulmates, but surely it wasn't perfect the whole time they were married. So I wanted to address that in the third book.
Yeah, they did have a rather amazing relationship. I read up on it as well, and it's almost heartbreakingly romantic as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Another aspect of your book that you play up very well is the horsemanship, where we can follow what she's doing as she's, you know, riding her horse, how her love for horses and her skill with them as well. And I understand that kind of comes from your life as well. Is that true?
Yes. So I don't know that Annie Oakley had a special horse in her life, or that she was a fantastic horsewoman or anything like that. And I should mention that Girl with a Gun, there is a prequel novella to that book called Shoot Like a Girl that I published. And it establishes her relationship with Buck and how she develops this bond with this horse who is with her throughout her career, you know, in my fictional world. And I knew that she did do some mounted shooting. There's photographs with her shooting on horseback. And there's a fantastic photograph, you guys should look it up sometime, of her side saddle. She always, you know, most of the time rode side saddle, and this horse is rearing up and she's in this side saddle, you know, riding this huge horse, and it rears up. It's a fabulous photograph. And so I knew that she must have had some skill. So, but I just didn't feel like I could write a book about Annie Oakley and the Wild West show without bringing in some kind of horsemanship, because I'm a horsewoman and I have been my whole life. And it just made sense to me. And it's one of the things that people, I think, like most about the book is her relationship with Buck.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's great. And it's also that you can describe the procedures for, you know, saddling a horse, for riding it, for controlling the horse, and not lose the reader as well. It's not so arcane that it's difficult to follow, but you can get the pleasure of it. Because I've only ridden a
Good.
horse once on my honeymoon, and of course it
Well,
was a very gentle horse, very, very pleasant, but still, you're still sitting up there like 12 feet off the ground on this huge animal who could stomp you in a moment if it had a will to. And it's
well,
uh,
and the scary thing about horses is that they're prey animals, and so their instinct is to run. You know, if something is threatening to them, their instinct is to flee, and so that always, it's like, you know, a bird. So that's always, there's always that sort of inherent risk with dealing with horses. So yeah, so it was so fun to really explore that. I had been studying natural horsemanship for about 10 years and really wanted to bring that forward into the novels, because it's so important to me that people know about natural horsemanship, and how you can really have a great relationship with your horse without force, without cruelty, without, you know, all of that stuff. Because people want to manhandle a horse, which when you think about it is quite silly, because they weigh like 1,000 pounds, 1,200 pounds. And, you know, there's no way we can outmuscle them. So it's better to work with them in the language that they understand.
so what are the principles behind natural horsemanship then? How does that differ
It's,
from what we're used to seeing?
well, it is more about using body language as opposed to verbal commands, or, you know, a lot of people, you know, when they get on a horse, they kick them to go and pull them to stop. But when you really study horses and horse psychology, they're incredibly sensitive beings. And, you know, they can feel a fly land on them. So there's really no need to, I can't stand it when I watch these shows and they've got, you know, someone taking off on a horse. First of all, they're yelling at the horse, yeah, yeah. And then they're kicking and, you know, doing all of this stuff when it's just so not necessary.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, television and movies and stuff don't do the best job of portraying the best way to communicate with a horse. And
Hmm.
so a lot of it's body language. If you watch horses in the wild or out in the pasture, there's a lot of like, if another horse is getting too close to a horse and they don't like it, they'll turn around and nip at them, or they'll, you know, kick at them, or it's all, you know, these principles of driving away, coming off of pressure, you know, moving into pressure, coming off of pressure, all those things that it just makes more sense to the horse. And horses are incredibly forgiving animals, because we've done a lot to horses, and we can make a horse do anything. But what I was interested in was having a partnership with my horse and working in partnership with the horse. So that's what I started studying natural horsemanship.
I think it's something that seems to require a lot of patience to handle, because it's a matter of operating at the horse's pace and thought processes rather than our own rush, 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 rush.
Exactly. It takes time. You
Yeah.
know, it takes a lot of time, but it's worth it. It's been, you know, I've been working with one of my horses on getting her to cross water, because we have a lot of these natural ditches to irrigate, and there's several water crossings, and she's terrified of water. And so using these methods, I have a trainer that I work with that has helped me, and it's taken me about 3 or 4 sessions, but she is now able to get her feet in the water without just blowing through and taking off. And it's, you know, the first few times was very, very frustrating, but I stuck with the principles, and it's working. So that was a big success, you know.
Well, that's great. That's great. That's fascinating. That is very, very fascinating. I love that, just because we've had cats and we've had dogs and we've had other animals. And the more we pay attention, the more we see they can think. You know, they do think, they think at their own pace, they solve the problems their own way, but they're trying to, and they try to communicate with us, and we have to be kind of more aware, I guess, just like we have to be more aware when we're with people about what they're trying to communicate. And that kind of empathy is really important to develop.
Right. I think working with animals just makes you a better human being.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well,
Yeah.
let's go ahead and talk about, you have another book series in the works, Grace in the Wings, about, as I understand, she is a costume designer and an amateur detective. And your first book, Grace in the Wings, is out, obviously. What made you decide to go to a second series?
Well, this book, Grace in the Wings, has been in the wings for several years, a decade or more. And I was just really fascinated with the Ziegfeld Follies and Broadway show business back in the day, and thought that it would be really great to, develop a murder mystery series in that era, and, using the Follies as a backdrop. So it had always been there. And actually, I started working on that book before I started the Annie Oakley books. But I had an agent at the time when, before I started the Annie Oakley books, and she's like, "You got to go with that idea, because that is really something, no one's done it before. It's really a great idea." So I sort of vectored to the Annie Oakley books, and then, always intended to publish the Grace books. I had only written the one, and right now I'm working on the second book in the series. So that's sort of how that came about.
Okay. So why the jump to, let's see, you already talked about that, about as far as the Follies are concerned. Again, it's another historical era in which everything has to be done kind of by hand. You don't have the mass media, you don't have cell phones. If you want to send a message, you got to walk over to the telegraph place, send a message, or I guess now pick up a phone. So but it's also kind of a slower pace, but it's still, you have technological advances there to deal with in the 1920s that Annie Oakley didn't have in her day. And that's also interesting, just the inventions, the way you have Annie Oakley, of course, she's starting, I can't remember now, in the 1880s, but by the 1920s, she has seen so much happen in just that short period of time. It's a really concentrated leap in terms of inventions and technology and everything else.
Right. And, in Grace in the Wings, I also have the love interest is a private investigator. So that, that kind of helps my protagonist a little bit, in that there's someone who also has, capabilities. Like Annie Oakley has Emma Wilson, who's an investigative journalist. She has her to kind of bounce things off us, to do things that Annie Oakley wouldn't be able to do, because, she's working in this world. And in the Grace books, Grace Michelle, she's, an apprentice costume designer. She's trying to, live out her dream, doing this, and her sister's murdered. And so a PI is hired to protect her. But in turn, they start investigating, what happened to her sister. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, and there was a little bit more technology, but not a whole lot, not a whole lot of, fingerprinting, I think, was just barely being used. And there was really no DNA testing. Autopsies, in the 20s, autopsies weren't routinely done, but they were occasionally done. And, of course, not very advanced at all. So that was also interesting to me. So it's a little bit more technologically advanced, but not a great deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what are your future plans? You said you're working on another Grace book, right?
Yes. This one is set in 1924. Grace has moved to Hollywood, and she's now working in silent films. And so she gets involved in a murder mystery in that, on the, a famous director is murdered, and so she goes in to investigate that, and she has reasons for doing it, and that's been really fun to research. So I'm doing that. Then I have another book that is coming out in the fall, in October, and it's a book that, again, I wrote quite a long time ago, self-published it under a different title way back in 2006, reworked it, retitled it, and it's a Southwestern mystery, and it takes place in the 1950s. So we've moved up a little bit in technology, but it takes place here in New Mexico on an archaeological dig. And it's really, you know, it's really the book of my heart. It's really a book that means a lot to me. And you know, it's one of my very first full-length novels, and people are like, oh, you should just keep it under the bed. And I just couldn't. I just had to keep working this thing. I think I've had it edited, I don't know, 24 times. I sort of cut my teeth on this book, and so it's finally in, you know, good enough shape that I feel comfortable putting it out there into the world.
That's great. And what is it called?
It's called Bones of the Redeemed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll be looking forward to seeing that in October then.
Thank you. Yes.
Absolutely. Well, and let's see, of course, your books are going to be available online. You want to tell us what your website is? Huh?
Yes, the website is karibovee.com, and it's spelled Kari, B as in boy, O, V as in Victor, EE.com. And I have a pretty robust website. There's a lot going on there. If people subscribe to my newsletter, I do lots of giveaways, contests, you know, lots of news and things like that. So
excellent. Yeah. And of course, Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop does have your books for sale. So if you want to go to mysterybooksonline.com, I'm going to have to make sure that's right, and you can order Kari's books there as well, and I highly recommend them. So this has been Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents, talking with Kari Bovée. Thank you so much for spending the day with us, and you have a good, hopefully,
I really had fun.
And have a cool day in New Mexico.
Yes, you too in Hershey.